I wanted to make a series of videos about getting into the hobby of collecting nice books. I think there's a lot of interest in the hobby these days, but I also feel that many people feel perhaps a little bit overwhelmed, perhaps even intimidated by the range of choice available, by the strange jargon and terms of art that booksellers sometimes use, and also by the fact that some of these books can be really quite expensive. So the aim in this series is to try to demystify things a little bit, help people understand what they should be looking for and to navigate the collecting landscape, and also to show that you don't need to be a multi-millionaire to get into this collecting hobby. So the topic of the first video will roughly speaking be what is a nice book and what are the things that we should be looking for when considering books that we might add to our collection. So to get started, I should probably talk about what I mean by a nice book, because that's indeed my term rather than a widely accepted one. But I use it advisedly because the common expression would be a fine book, but there's a lot of disagreement about what exactly that means, what does and does not qualify as a fine book. And I don't want to be exclusionary or to get into that debate, which might upset some people. So I'm going to broadly use the term nice book to refer to a book whose main attraction to a collector is that it has been well made from good materials. There's been a lot of thought and consideration put into the design and construction of the book, and generally the book as an object is a nice object over and above the contents, which of course we would also hope to be interested in. Now, if you look up the definition of a book in a dictionary, you're probably going to see something like a bound set of printed pages. And so absolutely the most fundamental function of a book is to take its pages and bind them together into some sort of volume. And so perhaps the most important of all attributes of a nice book is how it's been bound together. And the chief thing in particular that we should be looking for is not the obvious thing of what is this cover board made of, although that too will be important to some extent, but we want to look at whether this is a book which has a proper sewn binding. So perhaps not the highest end of bindings, but I'm going to use this Folio Society edition as an example. I think it's as good as any of what we really should be looking for. And that is that we have pages in a series of so-called signatures. So we have a set of pages that have been folded together into a bundle. And then the way the binding is constructed is that a thread is run through the middle of that bundle and is then used to attach it to all of the other bundles in the book. And so if we look here along the edge of the top of the book, we should be able to see those hoop shapes where those bundles of paper are formed. And that's a telltale sign that we're dealing here with a sewn binding. The other thing we can do to verify that this is a sewn binding is to take the book. So let's have a look at this copy of Midwinter, and we open it up. And if we look inside the gutter of the book in the middle of one of those signatures, one of those bundles of paper, we can actually see the threads that were used for binding running down inside the book. And that's a sign that these pages have been secured together physically with a piece of bookbinder's thread, and that will produce a very strong and durable binding. It means that we can open the book very wide and it will take that abuse. Not that I would encourage people to abuse their books, and it means there's going to be no danger of the pages falling out. Now, by contrast, if we take a typical trade book that we might encounter at the local bookshop, here I have an example, they're going to normally have a glued binding, meaning that instead of sewing these pages together, each page is just laid flat one atop the other, and then an amount of glue is run along the spine, and that thin layer of glue here at the spine is supposed to hold all of the pages together. And this book is a nice example of the ills of that approach to bookmaking, because the only thing holding this together was that glue, and it's inevitable that that will eventually fail, especially if the book is heavily read, and then you have a worthless pile of paper rather than a book because the pages are no longer bound together. There are a few notes of caution I would add to that. So the first is that we have two attributes to this book. So first, it is a hardback, as they're commonly called, so it's bound in rigid, stiff boards. And secondly, it has this so-called headband here that is running along the end of the binding. And both of those things may appear to suggest that this is a book that has been sewn together. But in fact, neither of those things are necessarily good indicators that this is a sewn binding. And I can show you that with an example. So here I have another trade book. It has a hard binding. It has these end bands. But if we look closely, we see again that telltale sign of straight sheets just going into the end of the binding and then stopping there. So there are none of those bundles of paper, those signatures that we're looking for in a sewn binding. And so this is indeed a book that has been glued together, just like that other trade book that I showed you. So those end bands often are essentially a piece of fluff that is glued on after the fact, not only in these cheap trade editions, but also, for example, in this Folio Society edition. This is just a glued on afterthought. It doesn't necessarily indicate that the book has been sewn together. Now, if you get a high-end sewn binding, those end bands may well be integral to the binding of the book, but oftentimes, as I said, they're just glued on as an afterthought. So that note of caution goes both ways. Here we have a book which is a paperback, and we may therefore be tempted to conclude that this is bound to have a glued binding. But when we look, in fact, no. We see those telltale bundles of paper, those signatures, and again we see those threads that are holding the binding of this book together. Many nice books are going to have a binding of book cloth. That means that the binding is covered in some cloth material, be it buckram or linen or something else. And that's generally a pretty good binding material that's going to be quite hard wearing. It's going to be reasonably nice to handle, and it's going to accept a wide variety of different designs that may be applied to the outer surfaces of the book. But there are also a range of other binding materials that one sees used. So this copy of Midwinter from the Whittington Press has a paper binding, so same general construction with rigid boards, but now they've been covered in paper rather than cloth. Obviously that paper itself, as here, can be printed with an intricate design. In fact, perhaps even easier to print than the cloth is. So this is the first volume of Florio's Montaigne from the Non-Such Press. And this is an example of what is called a full leather binding, because both the front and back board, as well as the spine, are covered in that leather material. Of course, there are many different types of leather. Generally, the best type to use for book binding is going to be the type sometimes in the trade called Morocco. It's actually a form of goat skin, and that will give you a nice hard-wearing binding that should stand the test of time very well. So I said this is a full leather binding. Let me show you some examples of other types of leather binding. So this is a copy of Julius Caesar from the Letterpress Shakespeare series by the Folio Society. And this is an example of what is known as a half leather binding. And we see here that we now have leather running along the spine of the book. The corners of both the front and the backboard are likewise protected with these little leather triangles, but the front and back boards are primarily here covered in paper. It could also be cloth, but half leather refers to the protection along the spine and then along the foredge of the book. We could equally have half cloth, and then instead of leather here we would have cloth, but it's basically the same idea. So that's a half binding. Here we have an example of a quarter leather binding, and we see, as you might expect, that now we just have leather running along the spine of the book, no particular additional protection to the foredge of the book there. And just as before, we could also have a half cloth binding. Again, that would mean that we have cloth running along the spine and some other kind of material here on the front and rear boards. A couple of other features of bindings are worth mentioning. The first is that often one will encounter top edges of the book that have been gilded. This gilding is a technique designed to protect the pages of the book from dust. So dust will settle here on the top edge of the book if it stood on a shelf, but this gilding will help to prevent that penetrating into the book itself and dirtying the pages. But these days it's used, I think, primarily as a embellishment to make the book more attractive. And so quite often on nice books you will find that you have these gilded top edges. Oftentimes when we look along the top edge of the book, we're going to see a very neat edge because the top of the book has either been trimmed or the way that the pages have been folded together means that we get a naturally straight edge here. But it's quite common in nice books to leave the bottom and foredge of the text block instead with what is called a decal. That means that the naturally wavy edge of this paper, which has often been made by some sort of mold or handmade process, is left exposed, and that gives us a sort of slightly nice tactile experience when handling those pages to feel that natural edge of the paper. That brings us on nicely to the topic of paper, which is probably the second, if not the first most important aspect of any nice book. Now, we can see the reason why paper is so important by again going to our old friend Band of Brothers here. And when we open it, we get something we experience very often with somewhat old trade books, which is that the paper has become, and it was never that nice paper to begin with, but it's become with age yellowed and altogether not very attractive. And so we should be looking for books that have a much better type of paper than that, a paper that is of archival acid-free standard, and more than that, hopefully a paper which is just generally of a high quality and is nice to handle. One of the things, by the way, that makes the paper in many nice books so good to handle is that it's made not only from pure wood pulp, but also has a high rag content, meaning the pulp used to make the paper had mixed into it either cotton or linen rags, and they gave it a more pliable, tactile experience, like one might associate with an old-fashioned banknote, for instance. Most nice books are going to tell you somewhere in the book what type of paper it's printed on. In this copy of Julius Caesar here, in the colophon at the front, we see it's printed on zircon mold-made paper, which was a very widely used paper among private press publishers, certainly in the last 20 or 30 years or so, until unfortunately the zircon mill was forced to shut down by flooding a few years ago. But even if we go to something a little bit more humble, like this other Folio Society book, Norwegian Wood, if we turn through to the copyright page of that book, we're going to see that this was printed on Abbey wove paper. That, by the way, is the paper that Folio Society uses for almost all of their modern standard editions, and it's certainly nowhere near as nice as the zircon paper that we had in this higher-end letterpress edition, but it's going to be a lot better than anything you have in a typical trade book, much nicer to handle with a smoother surface. This paper is not going to turn yellow or brittle, and altogether it's going to protect your investment and give you a nicer reading experience. One last point about the physical makeup of the book is that often when you buy a nice book, it's going to come not as a naked volume like this, but protected in some sort of box or case. So this copy of Norwegian Wood has this matching slipcase. It slides in there, and that is going to help to protect the book, of course, from any knocks and impact damage. Perhaps more importantly, it's going to protect the top edge of the book from that problem of dust settling on there that I mentioned before, even if this book is on a bookcase for a very long time. Sometimes, as we see here, those slipcases are printed with their own designs. This one even has a cutout, although that's not always the case. And of course, the primary job of this slipcase is to protect the book. Slipcases are perhaps the most common form of protection we encounter for nice books, but particularly for slightly higher end volumes, we sometimes get instead what is called a solander box, or sometimes a clamshell box, so named because it opens like a clamshell to reveal the book inside. I very much like this style of case. It always feels a little bit special to open up a box like that and have the volume waiting for you inside of there. An important attribute of a nice book is the manner in which it's been printed, and this is where things get perhaps a little bit controversial. So many collectors would tell you that to qualify as a fine book, it's really necessary that the book has been printed letterpress. That means that its production was conducted by the traditional method of taking type, often metal type, and inking it up and then impressing it against the page to leave the impression that we see here. And then wherever illustrations have been reproduced, they too were printed by taking the physical block onto which the engraving was made and inking it and pressing that into the page. Sometimes that letterpress leaves a telltale tactile texture to the paper where the letters have been pressed into the page, although not always, because many printers aim for a so-called kiss where they make only the most delicate impression necessary so as not to damage the surface of the page. However, not all nice books, in my opinion, are printed in that way. Instead, they're printed by the more common modern method of offset printing, where these pages are drawn up digitally, then a digital printer applies the ink to the page's surface. That means we lose out on some artisanal aspect of the book making, but I think particularly if you're new to the hobby and you're looking for an accessible entry point, it also makes the books much more affordable, and we still get all the benefits of the design thought that went into putting the edition together. There's also a sort of hybrid option where the pages are designed digitally and then those digital page layouts are turned into a photopolymer plate. So basically they digitally produce a plastic plate with the letters sticking up out of it, and then they will print that plate onto the page by a traditional letterpress method. And that's an approach that's used in many modern fine presses that aim to use letterpress but also want to print long-form works like a novel, where it would be prohibitively expensive to set the entire book by hand. So much for the physical makeup of the book, but there's more than just the physical construction that goes into making a nice book, because nice books are not only well made from good materials, but also have a lot of thought put into their design. We see that already a little bit on the way that these bindings of some of the books we've seen have been designed. So if we go back to Punishing Band of Brothers a bit more, often in a trade book, of course, what we're going to get is basically an advertisement printed on this paper cover, perhaps with some blurb from the editor of some newspaper on the back, or if we're not careful, even on the front. Whereas if we buy a nice book, we're essentially never going to see that. Instead, already as we encounter the outside of the book, we're seeing the design work of the bookmakers who have thought about how do we present this book in the best possible light. That may include, as here, blocking with metallic or gilt elements. It may include the printing of an original illustration as the one we see here. But that cover of the book becomes an integral part of the design. Very often, these nice books, though, are also going to have thoughtful design running throughout their contents. That stems, first of all, to original illustrations, which were a very common feature in nice books. So here in this copy of Norwegian Wood, we see examples of these abstract illustrations by Daniel Levano. They are printed in full colour on this nice, somewhat glossy paper. They look bright and vibrant, and they really help to bring the book, the story to life. They won't, of course, always be abstract. Sometimes we will have reproduced oil paintings or modern graphical designs. But in any case, there will have been real artist and illustrator commissioned to illustrate that specific edition of the book, and it's often one of the main highlights of these nice editions. I should say that if we go into the realm of artists' books and private press, often we won't have that sort of glossy, full-colour printing. Instead, what we're going to see is examples of wood engravings and other types of relief printing. So here the artist Miriam McGregor has carved these illustrations into blocks of wood, and they've been printed letterpress onto the page and are really an integral part of the visual design of the book. But in any case, those illustrations are a big part of the book's attraction. The other big part of the design of the book is the overall typographic plan. That starts first of all with the choice of typeface. And just like the paper, any good, nice book is in high likelihood going to tell you somewhere what is the typeface that has been used. So we can see here this was set in a typeface called Arno. If I take this copy of The 100th Story of A.E. Coppard by the Golden Cockerel Press, and I flip over to the colophon at the back, what we're going to see is that this book was the first set in golden cockerel type. So that's interesting because a lot of these historic private presses actually had their own typefaces cast into metal so that they could use them to print their books. And that gives those presses' outputs a distinctive look to them, which is another reason to collect those books. As a last example, I can't resist showing this copy of Sartor Resartus from the Doves Press. This book actually does not tell us what typeface it's printed in, but that's because everybody knows that Doves Press books were printed in the Doves Press's own type, Doves type as it's known, and are often considered among the most attractive fine press books from a typography point of view. The other thing we see here in this Doves Press book is that we have two colour printing, so as well as black, we have red drop cap initials. We saw already in that Folio Society book, we had green initials. So two colour printing is not a universal feature of nice books, but it's something that we see really quite often. And the last feature of the typographic design that I would point to, of which again this Doves book is a really nice example, is the way the text sits on the page. There's just a real nice even density of text on this page, which is a telltale sign of a book that has been very carefully designed. And Cobden Sanderson, who was responsible for designing this book, clearly put a lot of thought into the page proportions, the margin sizes, the spacing between the lines. All of that goes together to make a book whose type is a visually attractive feature of the whole. In other words, to make a nice book. So that's a brief introduction to what I mean by nice books and some of the things that you might want to look out for if you're starting to look for nice books that you may want to add to your collection. As I say, in the next video, I'm going to dive into how we can actually start to find nice books, where we should be looking for them online, and what we should be considering when we might choose to buy a nice book. So if you're interested in that, be sure to subscribe to the channel, and I hope to see you next time.